higher. John Kinsella's visit is also very timely in another, maybe more trivial aspect. We may consider it a good omen that it is on this particular day of all days, Seven Sleepless Day, that he has come to us from his sunny, dry and warm home in Australia, and the effect is being felt already. John Kinsella was born in Perth, Western Australia, in 1963. He is now, he told me, staying as a writer in residence in England, in Cambridge. Since 1989, he has published 6 collections of poetry in Australia. And earlier this year, a selection from these volumes, together with new poems, was brought out in Britain, the Undertow, New and Selected Poems, which is, I understand, available from the bookstall after the reading. Both in Australia and abroad, John Kinsella is increasingly being recognized as one of the most exciting new voices among the young generation of poets in a country which has a rich tradition and has a very rich contemporary scene in poetry. There are enthusiastic statements of praise, for instance, by Les Murray, the foremost Australian poet of the older generation, as well as by the famous American literary scholar Harold Bloom, who has characterized his work as so original, so fully formed, and so clearly destined to become part of the central tradition. I will only attempt one brief remark about his poetry, just to indicate maybe the range and orientation of what you might expect to hear. There seem to be 2 different interests at work in John Kinsella's poems, one more immediately accessible and the other more difficult. A number of his poems center on what one could call a distinctly Australian theme, the natural landscape and the harsh living conditions of rural Australia, particularly of Western Australia. These texts create a picture of this particular world which becomes vivid and memorable, especially in its distinctly, I think, sensuous qualities, like the silo, the pipeline, or rock picking. Other poems can perhaps be classified as language poetry, comparable to more international developments, as for instance in America or Britain. Many of these texts, it seems to me, thematize the function of art and poetry, the dangers and potentials inherent in the medium of art in its reaction to life, transforming, preserving, clarifying, or destroying, distorting, or killing life. These poems are often very subtly witty, playful, or satirical, alluding to other texts, playing with conventions and undermining especially readers' expectations, like on Andy Warhol's Marilyn Six-Pack, or I think the splendid sexual politics in Edward Muybridge's Man Walking After Traumatism of the Head, which John has promised to read tonight at the end maybe. At the end of his reading, he will be willing to answer questions, and he will also try and explain a little about his poetry. John Kinsella.
Thank you. I'm going to read a fairly eclectic selection of work tonight that I hope in some way will mirror my general concerns. I'm interested in working in a so-called formalist way when looking at so-called traditional themes, and I'm interested in working in a very non-formalist way, avant-garde kind of way, and language kind of way when looking at themes that are more to do with process and the way one writes and the way one interprets what is being written. I'm going to start with the more formalist stream. That doesn't mean to say that the material I will be reading is strictly traditional. In fact, thematically, it's very non-traditional. I'm going to read poems from something called The Silo, a Pastoral Symphony. They are pastoral poems that speak against the pastoral tradition. The idea that there's an idealized and idyllic landscape in Western Australia or Australia generally is quite absurd. The environment has been absolutely devastated by European occupation. The farm, my family farm, Wheatlands, so appropriately named, suffers extensively from saline soil, defoliation, and various other ecological tragedies. So it's not a pristine kind of beauty, it's a very harsh landscape, and it's one that's not only harsh in its own terms, but has been made more harsh by European interaction. I should also say that I work from a point of great guilt, because even though my family has been on this property for 5 generations, the previous occupants have been on it for 1,000 generations. And this is a major issue for me, because I can never actually call it my own in my own mind, because it's an occupied territory. However, I have no other place, and nor do my family, so it's as close to home as one will ever get. That kind of paradox runs through the work constantly. I'm going to start with a poem, the title poem of the book, The Silo, and just a brief point to go with it. In the early 70s, I was still at school. I heard the story, I read it in the local paper, about a family in a town just up the road, and just up the road in Australia can mean 100 miles, so, but just up there anyway, who kept a child for 7 years in an old stone silo. What was particularly disturbing and remarkable about this was that the whole town had known about it. It was later revealed, and had said nothing. And it fascinates me, these kinds of communities are very ingrown, and they don't easily accept outside influence. It would have been a local tragedy if it had become known outside of the immediate environs. So it was a matter of preserving the town's identity and dignity. So we're talking about a kind almost Gothic, and I mean Gothic in a fairly liberal sense, world that I'm often describing. The silo. Visitors, as if they knew, never remarked on the old silo with its rammed earth walls and high thatched roof, incongruous amongst the new machinery and silver field bins. Nor the workers brought in at harvest time, trucks rolling past the ghostly whimperings, snarls and sharp howls, cutting the thick silos baffling. Nor, when a bumper harvest filled every bin, and the farmer was hungry for space, no one ever mentioned bringing the old silo back into service. This had been the way for as far back as could be remembered. Thin sprays of baby's breath grew around its foundations, while wedding bouquets sprouted bizarrely from the grey mat of thatching. The sun had bleached the walls bone white, while the path to the heavily bolted door was of red earth, a long thin stream of unhealthy blood. Before those storms which brew thickly on summer evenings, red-tailed black cockatoos settled in waves, sparking the straw like a volcano, dark fire erupting from the heart of the white silo, trembling with energy deeper than any anchorage earth could offer, and lightning dragging a moon's bleak halo to dampen the eruption, with thunder echoing out over the bare paddocks towards the farmhouse, where an old farmer consoled his bitter wife on the fly-proof veranda, cursing the cockatoos, hands describing a prison from which neither could hope for parole, petition, release. Fog. For all its lymphatic nature, fog appears rapidly and spreads its shroud tightly about the farm. And though blinding, sheep and people stumble smoothly through its unduant body. Wood smoke fails to coerce its opacity and drops moistly. Apparently sectile, it flinches, though heals instantly. You drink its flesh with every breath. Settling on low ground, it climbs to the peaks of hills and spills, using trees and granite outcrops as hungry boards. A submariner, I walk the ocean's floor. The fog thickens about the family graves, tarnishing plaques and chilling icons to the bone. Finch's zip-like apparitions, the sun, a limp beacon, drifts to the rim of the system. I mark the blurred silver of a galvanized tank as a point for navigation and set off through the red flesh of failing saltbush, over a carpet of mustard sheoak needles. The ground sinks and thickens. In this quasi-world, I hesitate. As the fog burns my skin, I sense a fire's shadow and hear water crackling as it fuels the mass of liquid flame. A living entity, the fog accepts me. I move steadily on, confident that I will emerge without a mark on my body. The particular environment I describe is very much characterized by the language that is associated with it, as any environment is, human environment. The colloquialisms, even dialect if you like, of the region I come from is immensely different to, say, that in Sydney or that in Brisbane or that in Melbourne. There's an immense diversity in intonation and tones, even though there's this thing called Australian slang or strine or whatever you want to call it. There are many variations depending on regions. I'm of the school, the Robert Frost school, that sees regionalism as something that's merely a microcosm for the greater world. That doesn't mean I'm of Robert Frost's political persuasions or such, but just of his way of seeing the small as being representative of the large. And I believe you can explore a particular environment and be part of it and still be, international in your scope, whatever that means. I'd like to read a couple of poems that look at this kind of colloquialism, this particularly Australian, and in this case, West Australian voice. The first poem is called The Wild West, and it should be explained that the eastern staters, those who live along the east coast, and that's where the bulk of Australia's population is, see Western Australia, Perth, and the regions around it as being something of a frontier in comparison. That's where the wild people come. They sort of walk around with guns over their shoulders and, everything bad that could happen will happen, and, that kind of cliche. This is somewhat problematic because even though I know a few people like that, I know plenty who aren't like that as well. So this poem is really dealing with an outsider's perception of place. And in many cases, these people haven't actually been there. So we're talking about a kind of popularised image. The Wild West. While drinking in the saloon bar of a country hotel, pumping the jukebox, liquored up and making wisecracks, a gang of bikers pulled up en masse and hitched their bikes to the street posts, horse rails. A Valiant, laden with spare parts and grog, covered the leading flank. Filling the bar, they told us to piss off and shut our mouths. I asked one of them where he got his tats. He replied with a stare as cold as his beer. They drank from the jug, rolled joints, throttled on amphetamines, swaggered like gunfighters and petrol heads. We slipped into the public bar and watched over the shoulders of locals who stared with kinked eyes into the gibbering froth of their beers. The barmaid kept the liquor flowing. Give 'em enough rope! The local cop stood, arms crossed, eyes fixed, counting mugshots, smashed jugs. We left for an hour or so. Returning, a pool cue flew past our faces. Hey you, could I borrow your nose? And then it snapped. One of the locals, a fox-shooting, hay-bale-chested yokel, kicked a Harley and guffawed as the pack fell like the dominoes he'd seen in newsreels at primary school. Within seconds, he was sprawled broken-limbed over the pavement. There were cops everywhere, Reinforcements had been gathering on the outskirts of town and were moving in. The bikers saddled up, flicking a couple of cops through the butcher's window in the process. The law retreated and formed a line at the far end of the street. The bikers spread out on their revving Harleys. We stood in between. The standoff lasted 2 or 3 minutes. The cops waited. The bikers waited. And then, on the signal from the Valiant, the bikers peeled off in pairs and rode the gambit, lurching drunk and heavy through the cordon and into darkness. The Valiant fishtailing behind them. Fun place to live. Another aspect of this environment is its incredibly patriarchal nature. It's basically a very misogynistic environment where the bloke's way is the only way. And I have just finished a verse play which will be produced in Australia next year, which in part, it looks at sort of the mythologies of the rural environment in Australia, but in part deals, one of the major characters is a woman who runs a farm and who has to, by definition and by environmental definition, operate as a man within that environment. So the gender roles are altered according to that particular place. And I think that it'll probably upset a few people, which is good. Anyway, this poem is called Elf Reckons Lucy's the Bloke. And I think it says a little about this kind of environment, this rural farming environment that is so often idealised and idyllicised. Elf reckons Lucy's the bloke. Elf reckons Lucy's the bloke. She's the one with the balls, he says, spitting into the cattle grid. Yeah, I reckon Lucy's the bloke. That Anna's like my missus, always complaining but big-hearted and goddamn nice to the children. Stays at home. That Lucy, Christ, she ploughs and seeds and waters the stock. She handles a header as well as Jeff, myself or Jock. You've got to hand it to her. Yeah, I reckon Lucy's the bloke. There are quite a number of poems in here that Lucy stars in. She actually exists, and she's a pretty tough person, I tell you. She has my undying admiration. The aspect that most disturbs me about the environment there is the amount of destruction that has been wrought upon it, and this next poem deals with it with irony. I don't believe in the polemical poem. Not for me, anyway. People ask me. In fact, I was interviewed this morning and asked this. Someone said, why don't, if you feel so strongly about these issues, why don't you just say it point blank in your poems and say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and that's it. Well, that's of no interest to me as a poet. I rather work by suggestion and through figurative language. I believe the reader should be making these choices. It belongs to the reader to decide. I'll be talking more about this later when I move on to some more experimental stuff. But it's not mine to tell you what's right and wrong. It's mine to maybe capture those things that can't normally be voiced and to look and sort of convey. Why they stripped the last trees from the banks of the creek. They stripped the last trees from the banks of this creek 20 years ago. The old man couldn't stand the thought of bare paddocks with a creek covered by trees slap bang in the middle of them. A kind of guilt, I guess. Anyway, he was old and we humoured him. Chains, rabbit rippers, chainsaws. We cleared those banks until the water ran a stale sort of red. Until salt crept into the surrounding soaks. Furious he was. The salt left lines on the bath. The soap wouldn't lather. I think that's having your cake and eating it too kind of situation. I am quite fascinated by verse forms, traditional verse forms, and I often use sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, and such forms, but I use them in an ironic way. I try and play the strict sort of mode of patterning off against the content, and this book's full of this kind of thing. And this is called Goading Storms Out of a Darkening Field, and is in fact a villanelle. But a villanelle using Australian rhythms, and there's a kind of incompatibility there. Goading storms out of a darkening field, cock-eyed bobs seeding the salt, the farmer cursing the dry, cursing the bitter yield. And while lightning would savage him with skilled thrusts, and floods strip the topsoil, it's better goading storms out of a darkening field than sit distraught on the veranda, killed by the quitter's syndrome. It's much safer cursing the dry, cursing the bitter yield. Field bins empty, coffers bare, should have sold 2 years back when prices were halfway there. Goading storms out of a darkening field. Red harvest, charred hills, dry wells filled and sealed, sheep on their last legs, dams crusted over, cursing the dry, cursing the bitter yield. It's tempting when prayers and patience have failed, diviners have lost track of groundwater, goading storms out of a darkening field, cursing the dry, cursing the bitter yield. The parrot is an immensely important symbol in my work. It's interesting, all parrots, whichever variety they are, have intense colour and a great beauty about them. And they're often associated with not only Aboriginal law, but European law as well, post-invasion, if you want to call it that, European law, and LORE. And I find it quite disturbing that when you go along the roads of, say, the southwest and Western Australia, especially during summer, you see lines of slaughtered birds. The grain trucks after harvest go along the corrugated roads, the grain spills out the sides, the parrots feed on the grain, the truck that follows slaughters the parrots. So you have these corridors that go for like hundreds of miles of dead birds. And it's often spoken, you know, people go to Australia and they comment on the amount that they see more dead animals than they do alive. And it's true, because people just hit the, pedals and they drive. And, if you hit a few roos on the way, as long as you've got a rhubarb, who cares? That kind of philosophy. So the parrot represents something that is intensely beautiful and incredibly iconic in terms of the landscape. It's something that represents the fragility of the landscape as well, and how that beauty is a very temporal thing. I'd like to read 2 parrot poems. Parrot Death's Rites of Passage. King parrots, rosellas, and regent parrots are obviously all types of parrots. And another parrot I will mention shortly is a 28, which is a ringneck parrot. It has a yellow ring around its throat. They're all immensely beautiful. Take my word for it. Parrot Death's Rites of Passage. Blue clouds scuttle the eucalypt sun as it fizzes and winces with impending rain. Sultry weather dampening the orange hearts of king parrots. The scimitar roads cull the golden grain from dump trucks and belly spillers, tarps tethered loosely, illegal loads shifting over axles, tense with excess tonnage. Rosellas gather about the grain offerings and the torn bodies of the fallen. Wood smoke hustles a magpie lark out of an uncharacteristic torpor. A crow hangs low and watches intently. Observing the rites of passage, a regent parrot plunges into the dead eyes of a semi, eyes of silver nitrate, tarnished and stained shadow black. The orange, golden and emerald hearts of parrots litter the roads. I drive slowly and whisper prayers of deflection. I'd like to finish this particular section of the reading, if you like, with a poem that's quite different in tone. It's called Rock Picking Building Cairns, and it combines elements of the popular culture with this very traditional material, if you like, in terms of farming communities. But it's a borderline poem. The following poems I read will be much more that point in case, or that case in point, shall I say. Nice reversal of words there. And this is once again written in a very tight verse form. Rock picking, building cairns. Cairns are incidentally in this case piles of rocks that have been put together by going around the paddocks after they've been ploughed, collecting rocks, putting them on a truck. They're taken to a point where they're offloaded and formed into pyramids. And as you drive through the outback, you'll see lots of these cairns, and that's what they are. It's a kind of pseudo-ritualistic association attached to them as well, which is very problematic. Rock picking, building cairns. The spine is best kept straight. The weight of granite will damage vertebrae, stretch the spinal cord. Let the knees do the work. Legs levering the load from ground to trailer, dragged as a crawl behind the Massey Ferguson tractor. Cairnwards, we move over the paddock, building these self-contained environments for snakes, spiders, and bushwise architects. Ground lost is ground gained. These cairns are completely functional. Satellite cities linked by machinery that's commuter-friendly, if unpredictable. Rune stones carefully placed, oblattery, offerings for local deaths, accidents at harvests, on gravel roads, wild tractors overturning, augurs catching a hand and swallowing flesh. And deities only farmers know. Dried lichen and sweat mixed to cement a cairn, the surface suppressing the glitter of quartz, pink, rose, white, transparent. Sources of warmth, these repositories of microchip technology, unharvested, attract infrared telescopics, blood coursing through their Frankenstein monster bodies, distracting the predator's weapon as it roams in search of foxes and rabbits. Cairns, we use empty swollen bladders drunkenly into the fishes and cast amber bottles into cobwebbed abysses where wild oats grow at impossible angles and lure the sun into darkness. As I rock pick, I unravel these pictures and spread them to all corners of the paddock. I coin phrases, devise anecdotes, invest the ups and downs of my life in these cairns constructed from the landscape's wreckage. Place sheep skulls on summits. Alone I feed these rowdy cities the stuff of my blisters, sign the structures with broken fingers, convert plans to ash, and scatter them about the foundations. Softly, softly, I sing the ruins of our pampered anatomies, draw strength from the harsh realities of empire building. And following duskfall, the tractor and trailer no longer visible, I climb onto the motorbike and drape myself over the seat. A bag of bones slung over the tray of an iron jinker. As the tractor comes into focus, the cairns retreat. Pyramids of the outback. Now for a tonal shift, if you just excuse me. I'm going to now read from the Undertow, the new and selected poems which has just come out in England. The silo actually will be coming out in its own right later this year in England and is being translated into German by Margit Liebhardt, who translated Les Murray's work in the last few years, and that should be available in Germany in a bilingual edition sometime late next year. I'm very interested in what I call hybriding, and that is bringing this landscape, this specific way of seeing territory into conjunction with notions of aesthetics, especially regarding contemporary art. The first poem I'd like to read as an example of this hybriding or blending, if you like, is called Warhol at Wheatlands. Obviously, the Warhol is Andy Warhol, and we're looking at pop art, and the Wheatlands is the family property. Warhol at Wheatlands. He's polite looking over the Polaroid, saying, "Gee, I'm fantastic," though always standing close to the warm glow of the wonder heat as the flames lick the self-cleansing glass. It's winter down here, and the sudden change has left him wanting. Fog creeps up from the gullies and toupees the thinly pastured soil. It doesn't remind him of America at all. But there's a show on television about New York, so we stare silently. Maybe he's asleep behind his dark glasses. Wish Tom and Nicole were here. He likes the laser prints of Venice cluttering the hallway, the sun a luminous patch trying to break through the dank cotton air, and the security film on the windows. Deadlocks and hardened glass make him feel comfortable, though being locked inside with Winchester rifles has him tinfoiling his bedroom. He asks one of us, but we're getting ready for seating and can't spare a moment. Ring-necked parrots sit in the fruit trees and he asks if they're famous. But he doesn't talk much, really. Asked about Marilyn, he shuffles uncomfortably. Outside, in the spaces between parrots and fruit trees, the stubble rots and the day fails to sparkle. An interjection here. I can't resist this. The police busted me with a chilli in my pocket. It had been through the wash. It was, in fact, half a chilli, looking fibrous and not a little washed out. But there was no doubting it was a chilli. I accepted that. No need for laboratory tests. The eye and honesty, adequate analysis. So why do you do it? They asked. I dunno, just a habit, I guess. The sun dropped below the horizon like a billiard ball. The chilli glowed in a hand. One of them rubbed his eyes and they began to sting. We'll have you for assault, they said. It's true too. It really is. That was the funniest thing I've ever seen. I'm very concerned where the lyrical eye sits in contemporary poetry. Part of the project of the language school is to move away from the idea of the poet's persona speaking about him or herself and drawing the world to that point. So everything is really reliant on how we see it as the poet rather than any other factors. I sit under the apple tree, the day is jolly nice and it's all for me kind of stuff. I find that quite problematic, but I also find the idea of removing this lyrical eye from poetry equally problematic. I'm a great lover of the lyric, and I think that poetry is ostensibly about sound, and if you try and alter this in any way, you're going to have problems. I also think that you can't deny that there is an aspect of the author in the work, even though I believe that once the work is made, the author is dead, and that it's all about you and not about me. I'm only a voice for this stuff that's called writing. Someone else has written, not myself, surely. But it's that kind of process where the work becomes your work, not mine. And the reader actually creates the text according to the codes that are actually part of the text, and they interpret it in various ways. And this poem tries to deal with these notions. And it's called Self-Portrait Without Glasses. And I should say that if I remove my glasses, you do not exist. -5 diopter. Self-Portrait Without Glasses. And if anyone thinks of Mr. Ashbury, please do. 1. I am outside, and the rain has blown the rusty guttering, doused the fig tree. Porch-like ghosting squat concrete columns that would make this porch different. Architects specialising in duplexes are conscious of things like this. Even in low-income areas, familiar as I am with these surroundings, I remove my glasses and reinterpret. The squat becomes a lazy streak, condensing -5 diopter. A squint that will not focalise Corinthian or lay at length the wall deck nursery monotony. 2. A chilli merges with the glowing tip of a skywriting cigarette, trans firefly or lip slippage, premeditating a meteorite fizzing down through the outer atmosphere. Landscapes merge and concepts associate with blocks of colour. Floodlit in an open window and you'll catch your death. The sound isn't heightened, but there are variables of light. 3. Roadkill and G-locking. I stagger amongst cars, streaming the highway's Möbius strip. Crime qua crime, but not in full possession of the facts, I feel compelled to drop the case. Good sight is intransigent, despite the forecaster's radar echoes, scripted as paling and palsy, cops too pissed to give evidence after a record bust. 4. I sense to a neighbour, wondering about rain and shadow. Only Frankenthaler could with confidence instill rooms as inking puddles. And without my glasses, I might shuffle forward and fall, like my son, who says that television shows lolly-bloated children sinking through the floor. Now, I'd like to move on to Syzygy. Syzygy is a long experimental poem that comes to grips with the idea that a piece of work needs no reference beyond itself. It's entirely self-referential, and that even the word, the smallest component of it, is a thing in itself, which is an idea borrowed from the Russian futurists, not the Italian futurists, via the American language poets, who actually interpret it via the modern French theorists. So it's a very third or fourth hand concept. But I try and integrate it with a sense of immediacy in the language, which is very largely based on jazz improvisations, and the rhythms follow certain jazz movements. One piece of music I've been very interested in, which is a continuum, if you like, is called Frog Music. It's a project that's been going on for a decade, where a group of saxophonists who actually don't speak the same language get together at a spiral staircase, put microphones at equidistant sort of intervals along the staircase, walk up and down, playing their saxophones, and record it, then disappear and don't talk to each other for a couple of years. And I find that a really fascinating project. If you keep that in mind as you listen to this, you might get some idea. So this is a brief extract from Syzygy. 2. Fallout. A refugee from contention, I load stills into the projector, taking the negative impression, adjuncting expression, prizing anger out of its folds. The damage budding retentive, small experiment releasing heat. Remember losing these impressions? Machinery expressive and light-conscious, love scarifying poise, the tractor rocketing the clods of loamy earth, bootlegging frustration, mud brick and fence wire, circular saws, threatening rob at frosts. And doorpost jamming 2 years too old and rotting. The sun, orange plastic. Perfect. The film was black and white, and the sheep gurgling hysterically. 3. Self-regarding homunculus metal chambers, tinfoiling exclusions like humidicribs, wheeling slick asphalt deletions and stripping film. Dust water licking Axminster carpet spreadsheets, watch shows in the headlights or pinheaded spotlight. Crunch! Synthetic victims, and the frogs croak politely in their ditches. Halt! Goodyear wet weather halts the death of a zebra just outside a butcher's shop. Can't read the signs. Good, who gives a damn anyway? Needed, inquire within. Good management and sensible market indicators. Those who leave anything up to description need not remote opinions. Morality stinks, we keep it in buckets. 4. When the flappers tickle your fancy. Opposing needs, priming pellagra with plastic cement like jelly rubber, singing aging movies, tall tales, lugging grabness out of forums, humour-trophic, water glass or sundial, gas bagging in the shade. Ah, such is fame passing the time. The car comes, a stretch in tails, silk doors, predella, adjuncting talent, and the driver. Let us in, take us entire, rhomboidal, all, and ooh la la, so serious through disconnection, baffling sibilance. Oh my flappers, what a team we make. And the planets cohabitate and read life impression. You have your strict and your lax. The cups drink too much and the television in the back of the limo is stuck on the same channel. The driver is sucking himself, take no notice. You are my family, he splurges. Executors, guardians, trustees, receivers, inheritors, good sides, halfbacks, flankers, absorbers, potentates, contrivers, emissaries, agitators, incarnations, lovers leaping into the tide pile of my flesh. 5. The cane cutter. Reflects. Take a breath.
A snake operates amongst rough cane cutters' crystalline sweat. A particle overload. Heavy rain bearing down palpitating trifoliate with sun and cane. No rainbow makes an appearance. Earthy, very earthy. Miasma, camouflage mud takers, all takers, and throws back a marsh of fences. They beg for tariffs, they like restrictions. In the highlands, water is lightning, gaping press down and half bas relief. Turbine churn out comes down from high life where air is heady. No fireflies there. Doused and riddled, deep, deep south roots dry the bone black subterranean streams, rattled shapes forking azurine. I'm meeting archaeological light spent swarming the traps, for this is ground zero. Warholing in cyclone territory, zoning the sirens, equivocating hot dogs, pies, mushrooms pushed to the side of the plate. Cadillacs racketing, Monroe hubcaps, currency cut like love on a breezy day. Hot air concentrating in the sewers. 6. Life driver. Placating pit swimmers, the bone mill splurgers, credit cards, bursting middle-class prognosis, dialectic goodwill and science is upon us. Bursting prognosis, goodwill tragostanks, imprints form, lotus form, the new behemoth, a signature naked beneath the ultraviolet, Rex Regis, suppressing atoll watchers, spreading blood and bone over the garden. Lay down, devil, lay down, vroom! And so it goes on for evermore. But the language in it eventually disintegrates entirely as you go through until it ends up compartmentalised in little boxes, which some would say where it should stay, and slowly breaks down to morphemes and then to the word itself, if you like. It has a bit of punch in there as well, just to stir things up. But it ends rather ironically. It ends with a quote from an American concrete poet, Mary Ellen Salt, who wrote a poem called Flowers in Concrete. What was interesting about this particular poem, which was published in the March issue of Poetry in 1966, there's rather nice symmetry to this. So I've just edited the double issue of Australian Verse for Poetry, and I don't think they know about this poem, but you know, I like the symmetry of having appropriated them and now actually sort of being appropriated by them. But it ends in this poem. In its original form, it was shaped like a flower. So you got a very visual kind of effect. And even though the words that were used didn't really give you much of an effect of a flower, because they were done in that particular form, you made the words seem like a flower. So I removed the flower and just quoted the words. So this poem, in its effort to recognate, to come back together, can only do it with these nonsensical words that once were a flower. So it never actually can reform. It can never reconstruct itself. And she said, magnificent aureoles rousing insensate grief, oh long death suddenly. Here, bottle bush crees drag bloods out of cemeteries. That's how the poem finishes. So it actually doesn't have a resolution. In this book, Erratum Framed, which came out last year, a book of entirely experimental poems, there's actually something called Syzygy Reprise and Syzygetics, which goes some way to decoding that poem. So it's got to the point now where I'm writing poems on poems so people can actually find the reference points. But you get that. It's called The Project. I'm going to read one poem from this experimental book. It's called Skeleton Weed Generative Grammar, and it is dedicated to Noam Chomsky, who does like it. It should be said. Skeleton weed is a type of very noxious weed and vegetable, if you like, in Australia that gets into the headers as they go through the harvest of the crop and catches up in the machinery and wrecks it, you know, destroys it. So if they find one in a crop, they will quarantine it and wipe it out. And, you know, I suppose it's, you know, you're familiar with these kind of things here. But it's a very severe thing. And I've known of people's livelihoods literally collapse because of discovering this stuff. And every couple of years, people have to get on these long sort of trailers that are dragged behind tractors and sit looking at ground and, you know, very slowly dragged over. It's a very monotonous task. But I rather like the irony of it being such a monotonous and boring thing, but if you find one, it destroys someone's entire livelihood, so it's a funny juxtaposition there. Anyway, generative grammar, as you would probably know, is divided into three states, if you like: finite state, phrase structure, and transformational. The poem actually echoes these, and it has the brackets all in the right places. I made sure of that. So we'll give it a go. It's one of these hybrid kind of poems. Skeleton weed, generative grammar. 1. Finite state. The I takes in what is said. Yes, it is easily led across the floors of discourse, only to find itself a force easily reckoned with. There's no point in stock-taking arrears, as fleshly interests tell you nothing except acceptability and taboo. Take skeleton weed infesting the crop. Rosette of basil leaves unleashing a fatal stem with daisy-like flowers that drop into parachute clusters of seeds. One missed when they scour the field, men and women anonymously clothed, seated on a spidery raft, dragged behind a plodding tractor, monotony testing the free will factor, can lead to disaster. 2. Phrase structure. Analysing the constituents, we examine the wool of sheep for freeloading skeleton weed seeds, their teeth specifically designed for wool. The Ag Department have decided they are selective, though admit our investigations will help their research. Transformational. One year, the farmer asked us if we felt guilty for missing one, and hence ruining his would have been bumper crop. Quarantine the following year, losing his unseeded would-be bumper crop. Ruining his credit rating, his marriage, his sons and daughters' places at their exclusive city boarding schools, his problem with alcohol, his subsequent breakdown and hospitalisation. We remained and still remain passive. We still remain and remained passive. Still we remained and remained passive. But we looked deeply, collectively and independently into ourselves. Our silence was an utterance of a loud inner speech. A loud inner speech was an utterance of our silence. Speaking for myself, I've included in my lexicon of guilt the following. What I feel today, will I feel tomorrow? And those tight yellow flowers, so beautiful on the wiry structures they call skeleton weed. So that's a kind of hybrid between the world of the silo and the world of Syzygy. And I think that's where I like to be at the moment. It's a nice little ambient zone. I'll read a couple of the poems on. I think some of you attended a seminar last week, and I was asked to read Muybridge, the Muybridge poem as I call it, Sexual Politics and Eadweard Muybridge's Man Walking After Traumatism of the Head. I like long titles. In fact, early on I used to just write titles, and I've progressed now to actually combining it with a poem. But yeah, this is from a series of sexual politics poems. There's actually 5 of them, and I have to be careful here because I can get sued. In my first long-term relationship, long-term relationship, I lived with a psychologist. And she spent a lot of her life trying to work out exactly why I was like I was. And it was very problematic, I can tell you. Because every day I was something different in the DSM-3. And at one stage I was invited to go to Iowa to the workshop to give some seminars and lectures. And she looked it up in her big book and said, there is a greater proportion of manic depressants in Iowa than anywhere else in the world. That is what you are. So, anyway, this poem's for her. Sexual Politics in Eadweard Muybridge's Man Walking After Traumatism of the Head. He could easily be a man walking after traumatism of the head. There's something vaguely platonic about this. Francis Bacon lip-syncing his way through smugness, injecting passion and/or lust into Muybridge's studies of wrestlers. Actually, Michelangelo and Muybridge are mixed up in my mind together, and so I perhaps could learn about positions from Muybridge and learn about the ampleness, the grandeur of form from Michelangelo. This is not tongue-in-cheek. And why should it be, she cries. At the end of the day, folly counts for nothing, she says majestically, the banana-like glowing sedately by the bedhead, Foucault powerless and fading. 2. What moral autonomy remains as, from frame to frame, he walks? Why aren't you a panel beater? She asks as your last thought spills to the floor and scatters. Muybridge considered Leyland Stanford's quest to prove all four legs of a trotting horse are off the ground simultaneously at a particular moment. Earlier, he'd been a fly on the wall as Muybridge blew his wife's dashing cavalier lover away on the animal triste post-coitum. Sadness comes quickly, and he wonders about the contents of his blood, and panel beaters would find the passive role difficult to shape. 3. Showing a soul with lust in the prison of desire, he remarked that the form of his cellmate was a little peculiar. Casanova moving with the gait of one who has succumbed to animal locomotion, an electrophotographic investigation of consecutive phases of animal movement. She says that he measures progress with his penis, a well-oiled dipstick, her body absorbing the entire jungle of his body, which is ecologically sound, creeping out of its rich enclave and seeking to make the barren lush. He believes that you can't get off on rape, that violence is mental sickness. I like his manners, say too, she confesses. 4. A skull fractured does not necessarily mean liberation on the after-death plane, nor freedom for the oppressed mind. LSD, a freak in drag, denies the mind is lodged in the skull, that it is part of the body. The dozen or so blotters found in his pocket have nothing to do with his portfolio of deviance. He's on top of it, and knows the yellow haze suppressing the landscape is merely ash in the upper atmosphere. The signature is this: it hurts to come on bad acid, but did that ever deter you? 5. His head is traumatized by dehydration, his brain shrinking. Starvation has frayed the linkages between spinal cortex and legs. His walk is one of decline interrupted by hope. He feels spent and thin. Men eat to vomit and vomit to eat, Seneca tells us, and no woman can be too rich or too thin. Chastity is starvation. Starvation is traumatism of the head. 6. She hates the hype but loves the splendor. The page written, she relinquishes her rights to the material inherently hers. That's not true anymore. The moral community is concerned only with growth at the end of the day. He tells them that he is hers and couldn't give a shit. Does she reciprocate, they say? Would you, a man walking with traumatism of the head? 7. Underwire bras and jock straps entangle a chicken desperately lunging, a torpedo already within range of its tail feathers, rudely muzzling its way through a sea of discharge. So this is love, it asks. Muybridge screams from his observation post, "Keep the bloody thing within the gridwork! Calibrate, calibrate! For God's sakes, it's all comparative!" Stripping off, he rushes the chicken and wrestles it. "Damn the torpedoes! Keep the cameras rolling!" Duchamp's New descends a staircase, or Mesnoir du Nouveau and Ditali and Remington, Melovich and Giacomo Bala watch on excitedly. 8. When size doesn't matter, you better start asking questions. I mean, it's all or nothing, isn't it? As for what's behind it, a magnet does have two poles. Self-control, the object of pleasure. Every orgasm a spot in time without the lacework. And this all about walking with a traumatism of the head. The lexicon spread as three rednecks smash you over the skull with iron-knuckled fists, or an overdose of speed threatens to burst capillaries, or glass lodged in the crescent below your left eye dislodges and unplugs the contents of your identity. The time lapse between frames shortens and your collapse is traced more minutely. Hasten slowly. 9. Porn is the theory, rape is the practice. A sign held by a youth in Minneapolis. A skirt stained with sweat radiates in a bath of yellow dye. The gate is locked, the fence is high. She, sunbaking, looks over her shoulder, her tan slipping away. In a tree, perches her neighbour, a glint in his eye. 10. Stripping thought, he dreamt an anthology, visual and responsive. Reflections on the obvious. A spring day and I'm full of hate. Stuff like that. He would include a photograph of Muybridge, who after disposing of Major Larkins, apologised to the ladies and settled to a newspaper. Though not one of his locomotion sequences, whose implication goes beyond the book, but of the Colorado in dry dock, accompanied by an anonymous Muybridge on Contemplation Rock, later used as proof of madness. And on the title page, a quote from the San Francisco Daily Evening Post. Little did Muybridge dream, as he bent over the bedside of his wife and caressed her, that Larkin's kisses were yet fresh and hot upon her lips. So that's one of the worlds of sexual politics. But as I said, it's in 5 parts and it moves all over the place. I might finish with maybe just 2 more poems and then open it up for any kind of discussion. And you're welcome to ask me anything you want. I'll read one more Warhol poem. I've written a lot of poems about Andy Warhol. I've written a whole sequence of sonnets, experimental sonnets, on Warhol's screen prints. So I'll read one of those, and it's called On Andy Warhol's Marilyn Six-Pack. Rip top lips. The movement is piracy. An early cut. An addict's selective disclosure. A perfect pose concealing popular truths. The value of trashy, synthetic, polymer makeup. Canvas skin and silk-screened hair. A six-pack's hazy suppression of class and style, like seeing the world in black and white. Quick, look at me. It pleads with a fizzing hiss. If you stand long enough, success will expose itself. The pouch shapes the plates, but the eyelids take the weight, suspended languidly below the constructed eyebrows. Oh, Marilyn, 6 tabs without the blister packaging. I should point out that 6-pack in Australia is 6 pieces of beer, 6 cans or 6. Is that the same here? Well, it's universal language. How's that? And the 6 tabs in Australia, I don't know about here, but Rohypnol, which is supposed to be a kind of sleeping tablet, if you took 6 of them, would probably kill you or certainly knock you around a lot. Also come in these little 6-packs. I love the way they sort of, put things in nice little friendly amounts that are extremely dangerous and worrying. One thing that you may have picked up on in my work, it's heavily concerned with what I call American cultural imperialism. I am fascinated by American poetry, and in fact the poets in Australia I admire most have been heavily influenced by contemporary American poetry, especially the school of O'Hara through to Ashbery, the New York school I suppose you could call it, for want of a better expression. But it worries me to see the MTV syndrome where other things are being pushed aside because it's easy to watch, and American culture, as it's portrayed, say, in Australia, is an easy thing. Of course, it's not so easy if you're actually living there, but on your television set it is. And this worries me because it actually usurps the language and alters it in a way that's kind of nothing to do with the language itself. I think language is maturing and altering is a good thing because they grow with their needs. But to have something entirely artificially changed and there to be a massive gap between one generation and the next is kind of silly. The translation doesn't work, and I'm quite fascinated in what causes this and how it can be expressed in poetry. I might finish with an elegy, Full Fathom 5. I wrote 3 elegies for a friend of mine who drowned himself a couple of years ago. Early on in my 20s, after I'd sort of finished my studies, I lived in Bangladesh for quite a period of time with this guy, and he ended up staying basically and lived a lot of his adult life in Bangladesh, Nepal and India, and he had to come back because of money reasons and some private reasons. In 1993 it was, in fact, beginning of 1993, and the culture shock was so severe and it really disturbed him so much, he just walked into the river in front of a lot of people and drowned himself, and it was a particularly distressing thing, obviously. But I have used that, and I use the word "use" with big quotation marks because it does worry me the elegy is a kind of pure form, but it is also a kind of appropriation. The person has no right of reply. It's about that, but it's also a commentary on how we deal with art, because in a sense, all usage of art is an elegiac process, especially in the case that I'm using Pollock here, and I'm using James Joyce, and I'm using Shakespeare as my points of reference. And I'm doing that same thing I'm doing with my friend's death. So it's a poem that questions how we deal with material that's not directly related to ourselves, and which is now part of history, if you like. Full Fathom 5. 1. Gallery-wise, it rates as a painting of unfathomable depth. On my desk is the surface of both a puddle or an ocean. As they say, you can drown in both. 2. I've a great uncle who captained a bullion ship which capsized during a storm rounding the Horn. These the eroded treasures noted by Landau as occurring in the swells and rips of paint. 3. There he is, hook it quick. Full Fathom 5 dredge deep the glory of drowning in a river or taking to sea and being dragged back to shore. The hook as sharp as sight honed by shamans, the corpse a prismatic reflection of the living body. Chaotic fish dissect currents, dislocate reefs, and scatter sandbanks. They will not be recruited as pallbearers. 4. Full. What if the ocean's floor is fluxive, a mixture of excrement and bone, lime slurry and sand, mud and decaying tissue? Full Fathom 5 multiplied, the formula variable, a multi-storied apartment or funeral parlour. If so, the basement is never featured in the catalogues or brochures. 5. Full Fathom 5, the eyes burn the undertow, state-changing, vaporous, liquid, solid. A body's flow down arrests pollution, death, a notion of the surface. I submerge the image. 6. Pebbles and tacks, pennies and buttons, a pair of keys, combs and matches, cigarettes and paint tube tops, fallen overboard and swallowed by dent sweeps of effluents and colouring agents. 7. In finding his way, Pollock may have joined the path of suicides, the ocean a forest through which you approach the circles of inferno, molten, drenched in spirits. The jewels of distortion shine in the blue-green flurries, and the wreckage of a brief life unwinds the silver threads of darkness. Thanks a lot.